The first historical record we have, probably of John Knox, he is carrying a two-handed sword, serving as a bodyguard to the fiery Protestant preacher, George Wishart. The year is 1543, and for the next few years, Knox will be ready to draw steel to defend the faith against Catholic henchmen employed by Cardinal David Beaton. Things took a turn in 1546 when Beaton got the upper hand, arresting Wishart and having him burned at the stake. Protestant nobles were incensed. They stormed the castle in St. Andrews and assassinated the cardinal. Knox arrived shortly after as a preacher for the rebellion. But the rebellion didn't last long. French ships arrived and bombarded the castle, and eventually the rebellion had to surrender. Knox was captured, found guilty, and strapped to an oar in a galley as a slave for 19 months. And if that's not the most Scottish way to start a ministry in history, I don't know what is. But the story of Knox is not very well known, at least not outside of the historian wonk circles. And there are reasons for that. First and foremost is Knox didn't leave a lot of writings. That's why you don't have folks that walk around calling themselves Knoxians. But also the story is from 500 years ago, and as I've already said, there's a lot here. That's only the beginning of his career. And so I want to tell you the story of John Knox. I want to go through his life, give you the ups and downs, and as you'll see, he went just about everywhere in the 16th century. He's involved with a number of controversies before he finally lands back in Scotland to shape the nation there. But then I'll also give you a sense of his thinking, some of the ideas that he said that were controversial, and I will tell you one idea that he held and he taught that you believe today because of him. So let's look at the story of John Knox. To step back into John Knox's world, we're going back 500 years to a small market town in East Lothian, Scotland, around 1514 or 1515. This is Haddington, a bustling little hub nestled near the banks of the River Tyne, and it's here that John Knox, future Firebrand of the Scottish Reformation, takes his first breath. Now, to understand John Knox, you need to zoom out a bit and understand the world that he is born into. Scotland in the early 16th century isn't the picturesque land of castles and kilts we might picture today. It's a rugged, often harsh place where life revolves around survival, faith, and loyalty. The country is ruled by a monarchy. King James V is the monarch during Knox's youth. But power is a messy tug-of-war between the crown and a patchwork of nobles who control their own lands and armies. And these nobles, like the Earls of Bothwell near Haddington, aren't just landlords, they're kingmakers, and they are sometimes troublemakers. Then, of course, there's the Catholic Church, the giant that's looming over daily life. And the church is not just a spiritual guide, it's the glue that holds society together. The church owns vast estates, and it runs schools, and it even has its own courts to settle disputes. And priests are everywhere, from grand cathedrals to tiny parish churches like St. Mary's in Haddington. And they were the ones who would teach you to read if you were lucky enough to learn to read at all. For ordinary folks, life is tough. If you're not a noble, you're likely a farmer or a merchant. In general, if you are poor, you stay poor, unless, that is, you have access to the church. And that is where John Knox, life takes him. So the little that we know about the Knox family is just simply that his father was something what we would call a middle-class earner, probably a merchant or a farmer, or he might have had a small plot of land. It would have been a modest living. We also know that John had an older brother, William, who likely was there to step into whatever role the father held. In those days, the eldest son inherits the family path, while the younger sons, like John, have to carve out their own. But the Knoxes aren't entirely without prospects. There's a little bit of a whisper in the record historically that they have some ties to the Earls of Bothwell, and the Bothwells are big players. Patrick Hepburn is the third Earl of Bothwell during Knox's youth. Yeah, and he's a man of ambition, and he's very much tangled up in Scotland's political dramas. And he's even at one point rumored to be having his eye on the Queen Dowager. But if the Knoxers are somehow tied up with them, then there is a sense that they would have a certain amount of a leg up or a certain amount of privilege. So it would have been likely that William would have been out with his father, learning the family craft, whatever that might have been, and young John would have been home with his mother and his other siblings. A simple life. But it's one that Knox never forgets. Years later, when he's preaching all of his thunderous sermons and writing his tracts, he will sometimes sign his work Tenetarius, which is Latin that means a man from the banks of the river Tyne. It's a badge of pride. He remembered where he came from all of his life. Education for John, like most boys his age, was not a right. It was a privilege. Attached to St. Mary's Church there in Haddington, there is a school as we know it today, but it wasn't one of like desks and chalkboards. It was a place where boys, mostly destined for the church, learned the basics: reading, writing, and chanting or singing. And the textbooks were just prayer books or psalters, all in Latin, and that language would be drilled into these young boys so that they can speak Latin as well. The goal is practical. Train the boys to join the choir and serve the church that dominates the world of that day. So what would a day have been like for John? Well, he would have been around 8 or 9 years old, sitting on the floor cross-legged with all the other boys, while a stern priest drills him in his Latin grammar. Amo, amas, amat. All you who had classical education represent. And they would have practiced the hymns and all these things in this repetition that, though grueling, would have been a lifeline for these boys. You see, most people in Haddington never learn to read. They're too busy herding sheep or hauling water. But for John, this was his ticket out. And his quick wit does not go unnoticed. And his family at some point sees the priesthood as his best shot, not just for himself, but for the family. A priest in the family means respect and a bit of influence. So after John finished song school in Haddington, he was sent to the University of St. Andrews, a leap that takes him from the narrow streets of a small town to one of Scotland's intellectual heartlands. And this is right in the teeth of the Reformation. Lots of new ideas are spreading, lots of radical ideas are being discussed in the halls of academia. And John Knox arrives there as a teenager, wide-eyed and eager, ready to study under one of the area's heavyweights, John Maier. Now, Maier's legend as a theologian is pretty significant. He was a theologian who had taught at Paris and Glasgow, and his books were read all across Europe. He's not just your average priest, and his ideas were actually a little bit dangerous. He's what's known as a conciliarist, meaning he thinks that the church's power should lie not just with the Pope, but with the Pope and a council of bishops. It's a radical idea. It's this idea that the power is distributed not just in the Pope, but throughout the entire college. Now, it was a radical idea, though at the time it was still orthodox or allowable within Catholic theology. For John Knox, though, Maier's lectures seem to have been a bit of a revelation. Knox himself will later say that Maier's words were as an oracle in matters of religion. And we're not saying that Maier gave Knox the idea of Reformation, but we are saying that during that day, debating the authority of the Pope during the Renaissance papacy, when there was a lot of, frankly, corruption within the papacy, became a new fashionable idea that, hey, there is something wrong, we need to deal with it. Conciliarism during the Reformation was seen as agree that there's a problem, but being unwilling to go where Luther goes in terms of conclusion. So maybe if we just distribute the power within the Catholic Church, we can remain Catholic and take our lumps and learn our lessons and start over. But we don't have to do the Protestant answer. Now, conciliarism will eventually be slapped down. It'll be considered piecemeal and sort of on the road to Protestantism. And for Knox, maybe that's what it was. But he certainly didn't become a Protestant anytime soon. In fact, by 1536, Knox is back in Haddington, a freshly ordained priest at around 21 or 22 years old. He's made it. Years of study have paid off, and he's now part of the church he grew up serving. But he isn't just about sermons and sacraments. He also doubles as a notary, a job that's less glamorous but just as vital in that city. Notaries were kind of the record keepers of the day. They would write wills and, seal contracts or witness deals between two merchants. You have to understand, in a town where most people can't write their own name, this is a role that carries a lot of weight, being a notary. So you have to understand Knox's life for a very long time after he graduates from St. Andrews is just the hum of the church. He's at St. Mary's, he's doing Mass, he's doing his priestly duties, he's hearing confession, then he's back at the desk, working as a notary, serving the community and his neighbors. In other words, Knox is a very loyal Catholic at this point. And if there is any rumblings of Reformation in his mind, he certainly doesn't seem to show it for some time. The Reformation was far off in Germany. And in fact, it's always worth saying that the Reformation in Scotland was one of the least likely places for the Reformation to occur anyway. Change there would have been slow and dangerous. The country is Catholic to its bones, backed by the king and the church that sees Protestantism as a threat. I mean, the Reformation is as likely to plant in Scotland as citrus is as likely to plant in Scotland. It's not happening in the beginning of the 1500s, and even by the 1530s, when Knox is back as a priest, there is nothing that is going on that's going to allow the Reformation to take root. That is, of course, until 1543, about 7 years after Knox has become a priest. In 1543, Regent Arran, ruling for the infant Queen Mary, had what is known as a godly fit, which is to say he had a flirtation with reform, and he started to back or allow preachers like Thomas Gillam and John Ruff to hit the road railing against Catholic idolatry, things like statues and relics. Their words, in other words, were bold and risky, but they were finding an audience. And you have to understand, that move, again, is seen as piecemeal. It's not yet fully Protestant. It's the idea that you're going after corruption, you're going after the abuse. And you're sending these preachers out to say, this is not true Catholicism, to do all these over-the-top rituals. It's seen as reform from within, still, but they're being allowed to do it because they're simply preaching against corruption. And the background of this is important because John Knox is about to make a very serious challenge to his faith and make eventually the jump all the way to Protestantism. But you have to understand that it's this situation that is driving it. Scotland by the mid-1600s was a rough place. James V had died in 1542, and his newborn daughter, Queen Mary, was, as I just said, a baby. And anytime you have an inherited monarchy and there's a baby on the throne, you have chaos. Nobles will jostle for power. And the Earl of Arran can't end up picking a side. 1 minute he's with Protestantism, the next he is cozying up to Catholic France. And it's in this situation that Cardinal David Beaton, the person I mentioned before, clung to control like a drowning man to a raft. And so those preachers go out, and Beaton himself wants that put to a stop, so he sends men out to seek them, to arrest them. And one of those men, in 1545, was someone that John Knox took a liking to very, very much. And his name was George Wishart. And Wishart was not some mild-mannered reformer. He was a firebrand, a preacher who radiated defiance, fresh from Switzerland, where he'd studied with Zwingli himself. And Wishart hit Scotland like a storm, preaching in open fields and dodging the church's enforcers. And his message was more radical. Not just let's go beyond corruption, but forget priests entirely, indulgences entirely, and all the rituals. Faith in Christ is all you need. Now, Knox doesn't just admire Wishart from afar, he eventually signs on to be his right-hand man. And that is where we began this video. And it is pretty remarkable, the change that Knox does. He doesn't just get rid of his priestly robes and move on and start a life somewhere else. He throws off the robes and straps on a sword. And it tells you something about Knox's personality. He is willing to be radical. But imagine this, a guy who had spent years as a Catholic priest, now trailing a heretic with a claymore strapped over his shoulders, ready to fend off the attackers. That's how deep Knox was in. And Wishart's fearlessness rubbed off on him. But for Knox, this was a crash course in what it meant to live and maybe die for your beliefs. And I do want to say one thing right there, because this is part of what will become, at least in the English-speaking world, the Reformed tendency, might be the word, which is Knox really is very much obviously going to have the same theology as a John Calvin or a Zwingli or others within reason. He's going to be in the Reformed camp, but he's going to be a different type of person. And I always say that this way. If John Calvin is upset with you, doesn't like what you're saying, he's going to raise an eyebrow. And then, if he is really upset with what you're saying, he will raise his quill. John Knox, though, same theology. If he's upset with you, he's going to raise his voice. And, if needs be, he will raise a fist. And I'm being a bit playful when I say this, but if you want to understand Reformed history, this is kind of it. You have the writers and you have the fighters. And sometimes the fighters are the writers, and then it gets really spicy. But you do have a tone like this that emerges within the Reformation. Knox is a firebrand. Knox would have loved to have been an apologist on a college campus today, or on a podcast. He would have been the absolutely fearless, I will tell anyone exactly the truth in a confrontational style, usually extemporaneously, and I will do so with all the conviction that I have. And Calvin, of course, is the writer. Same theology, same convictions, just one's a writer, one's a fighter. So what you'll see in Knox is not a man who's going to sit down to write a lot of treatises or long books of dogmatics. Instead, he's going to fight and push throughout the course of his life. Of course, Wishart's run didn't last forever, as I said. Beaton's men nabbed him, and they dragged him to St. Andrews, where he was burned at the stake on March 1st, 1546. And as I said, Knox eventually arrived at the camp thereafter and became preacher to the rebellion. And so Knox didn't wield the knife. He wasn't a fighter in that sense, but he did join the rebels soon after. And for those few months, like I said, St. Andrews was this strange bubble, part fortress, part refuge. The rebels held off a lot of the attacks from the regent, but eventually, as I said, the French ships came and they bombarded the castle. The rebels surrendered, and Knox, along with others, was shackled and shipped off to France. And the French, of course, sentenced him to the galleys, floating prisons where men rode until they dropped dead. And for 19 months, Knox lived an absolute nightmare, chained to a bench, oar in hand, back bleeding from the whip. Food was scarce, rest scarcer. It was torture by any name, meant to crush his body and soul. But Knox isn't the type to break, as you'll see repeatedly throughout his life. One day, he later tells us, a Catholic officer thrust the image of the Virgin Mary in front of him and demanded that he kiss it. And Knox tells us that he grabbed it and threw it in the sea and says, "Let the lady save herself. She can learn how to swim." That's the raw, reckless defiance of Knox. He wouldn't bend, not even under the lash. And we do have to acknowledge, of all the major reformers, Knox is the only one to bear this level of infirmity for the rest of his life. Now, I'm not going to say that others didn't pay with their life. Of course they did. William Tyndale, Cranmer, many others were burned at the stake or executed for their faith. What I am saying is that no major reformer endured this level of torture, almost 2 straight years of it, before he even begins his ministry. This is the beginning of his ministry, mind you. He is tortured for his faith from the beginning. You cannot underestimate the power that has in shaping this man's future and his understanding of just simply the raw determinism that he has. He bears scars. He absolutely has infirmities from this. He's likely to have walked with a limp. No one else had this. No one else bore this amount of torture in their body in the Reformation. I mean, Luther was put on trial, but he died fat and happy in his bed. Knox was hard-boiled, made of iron after this. And for 19 months he suffered, rowing the oar, praying that hopefully one day he can get off the boat. It can be a little strange to describe Knox as an Anglican priest, or that he had any sympathies whatsoever with the Book of Common Prayer. But as we're about to see, in fact, the beginning of his ministry was as an Anglican priest. You see, because in 1549, King Edward is now on the throne. Henry VIII had passed. And under Edward's reign, England was thoroughly Protestant now, moving increasingly so. And they wanted these men on these boats back. And for Knox, this was a godsend. All of his ministry until now, he'd either been a hunted man in Scotland, a preacher on the run with Wishart, or he had been a slave for 19 months rowing the galleys. But with England's diplomats, eager to bolster their own Protestant ranks, they negotiated the release of Knox and others, and they brought them to England, and they sent him straight to Berwick-upon-Tweed, a rugged border town bristling with soldiers, and he was there to serve as their chaplain. And this is one of my favorite parts of Knox's story, because this is really a rough town, Berwick-upon-Tweed. It's not a cozy parish. This is a fortress town hugging a wild border with Scotland, and its stone walls are scarred from centuries of sieges. It's a military hub. It's packed with all kinds of folks. I mean, it's a lot of cussing and drinking. Let's just call it what it is. Gunpowder, sweat, mud. It's a military town. And Knox is a chaplain. Not exactly a young preacher's dream gig, but for Knox, it was perfect. These soldiers were not soft churchgoers. They were tough, practical men who had seen bloodshed. Knox himself had held the oar and shed his own blood for his faith. He spoke their language, blunt, fierce, and straight to the point. I mean, I'll just go ahead and say it. Knox definitely has seen a bar fight or two in his early ministry. You're not chaplain to a roughneck town like that without it bearing some consequences. So, as chaplain, though, his job was to lift their spirits and to preach for the Reformation. And that's what he did. And it brings up one thing about Knox's preaching, is that he seems to have been extemporaneous in a lot of his preaching. This is something he seems to have picked up from Wishart, who would do more of the open-air preaching, thundering against idolatry type of what we would later see, frankly, in the Great Awakenings. Knox cut his teeth under that style, and he doesn't seem to have written many of his sermons down, at least. This is why we don't have many of them to show evidence from. He would just get up and preach, as far as we can tell. With preparation, of course, but he wanted that show-me-your-eyes moment as the speaker. And that's exactly what he did. He went after the Mass, he went after idolatry, and he started to preach for the Reformation with these roughneck soldiers and sailors there in Berwick-upon-Tweed. And Knox's bravado in these early days actually got him noticed. John Dudley was the Duke of Northumberland in that area, and he was a heavy hitter in Edward's court back in London. Dudley wasn't himself much of a religious idealist, he was a pragmatist, but he liked a good tool when he saw one, and Knox had a knack for firing up the crowds. And that was exactly the kind of voice Dudley needed to keep the Protestant momentum going. And so the Duke actually throws his weight behind Knox, shielding him from anyone who wanted to muzzle him for being too extreme or too radical in his call for reformation. And that's not just a pat on the back either. Dudley's support actually gave Knox breathing room to push his agenda. And it also raised his profile, turning him from this border town preacher into a player, eventually, in the English Reformation itself. And it is one of those great what-ifs, because it does seem to be the case that if things had gone differently, it is a high probability that Knox would have lived the rest of his life an Anglican priest pursuing reforms from within. He might never have gone back to Scotland. But amid all this upheaval in the beginning of his career, another unexpected thing happened. Knox fell in love. He met Marjorie Bowes, a young woman from a solid Protestant family. Marjorie isn't like Knox. She was actually very calm while he was stormy, and she was more reflective where he was brash. But she was sharp and devout and very much drawn to his passion. And they hit it off, and before long they were married. Another big step for the ex-priest, who had sworn off women, but now as a Protestant had embraced clerical marriage. And into his life, not only does Knox get his wife Marjorie, but he also gets one of his closest friends and personal confidants, which is Marjorie's mother Elizabeth. Elizabeth Bowes is a devout believer herself, and Elizabeth clicked with the Knox family right away. And for whatever reason, she and Knox became the best of friends. Well, I mean, let's give it up for good relationships with your mother-in-law. And they started to write letters, long, heartfelt exchanges about faith and life and the battles that they both faced. And they weren't dry debates either. They were personal, showing a side of Knox that didn't make it into his sermons. I mean, he was a guy who cared and who leaned on his family and his loved ones when he was going through a tough time. And there really is a duality in Knox's character and his personality that Jane Dawson and others are beginning to point out, and it's worth knowing now as well. When you're a firebrand and you're a controversialist, it is very easy for every part of your life to be seen as that type of personality. And there is a bit of a man, the myth, the legend, and the man behind that myth when you get to looking at Knox. I mean, I even played into it a bit by discussing the way he starts his ministry with the claymore on his back. But in recent research, we've come to the point of realizing that he actually was a man of melancholy spirit at times. And he had, your day-to-day doubts and your midlife crises. And, he lost his wife at some point, and he had to remarry. And he had the infirmities of torture and other things in his life. And he lost a lot of friends to death. I mean, you don't go through that amount of life and not have it bear some scars, physical and spiritual and emotional. So in this day and age, he finds his first career success in his ministry with Northumberland. and he finds a relational soft landing with his wife Marjorie and his mother-in-law Elizabeth. So Knox's time in England was actually a bit of a golden window. He's an Anglican priest, a chaplain for all of these very interesting characters there in Berwick-upon-Tweed. And it's a time to preach and to grow and to build his life for the first time. The problem is that it wasn't to last long. Edward VI's reign was on borrowed time. And with it, England's first step into Protestantism was as well. Knox's world was about to flip again, forcing him to flee once more. In 1553, England's fragile Protestant experiment came crashing down. Edward VI, the young king who'd given the reformers like John Knox a foothold, died at just 15. His half-sister, Mary I, a staunch Catholic, swept onto the throne with a mission to wrench England back to Rome. For Protestants, the air turned thick with danger. Mary's enforcers began rounding up dissenters, mainly the bishops and the priests, and the smoke of burning stakes soon stained the sky. This time Knox escaped. He wasn't going to stay and fight, and so he packed up his family, and he fled to Europe. And by 1554, he had slipped across the Channel, landing first in Dieppe, France, then bouncing between Protestant hubs like Frankfurt, before eventually settling in Geneva in 1555. And I'm going to say more when I get into his controversies about his brief time in Frankfurt and why he gets kicked out. That is an important part of the story. But I'm going to skip it for now and just jump to his time in Geneva. If John Calvin was the brains behind Geneva, the city itself was his canvas. He was a French exile himself. Calvin had arrived in Geneva in the 1530s, intent on building a church that did not answer to the Pope. And by the time Knox got there, Geneva was a Protestant showcase, a place where theology wasn't just debated but lived. And Calvin had stripped worship down to just the bones. No altars, no priests chanting Latin, just scripture, preaching, and plain spoken prayer. No hierarchy of bishops. It was run by presbyters or elders chosen by the congregation to guide and engage in discipline. And Knox was smitten. Let's just say it. He called Geneva the most perfect school of Christ, which is a rare gush from a man that almost never praises anything. That's just not his personality. But the main thing he loves there in Geneva is the simplicity. The Bible there is read aloud and explained in terms that everyone could grasp. And services swapped out things like music and incense for congregational psalms and a very unordained devotion. Very far cry from the Catholic rituals Knox and others despised, and even some that they didn't like that had remained in England. But Calvin's vision went beyond worship. He believed the church should actually stand apart from the state, free of monarchs who would use it to twist faith for power. Yet he also saw the church as the moral anchor for society, keeping Geneva in line through discipline. Not a flawless system. People would grumble about it being oppressive. But for Knox, it was a revelation, one that he will later carry with him back to Scotland. And there in Geneva, Knox wasn't idle. In 1555, he took up the pulpit there for the English congregation. A lot of these exiles had arrived there as well, and they were giving a building to use as their sort of refugee church. Knox dove in and preached with his usual fire, and he helped shape the worship there and the principles that were similar to John Calvin's. And it wasn't a solo gig either. Knox worked shoulder to shoulder with Calvin and Geneva's other ministers, soaking up their wisdom. They would all meet in councils, and they would hash out theology and governance, and they would spend a lot of, frankly, what we would call downtime together. And in this, Knox saw a system where elders, not bishops, called the shots, and elected men who knew their people, not distant lords in robes and with opulence. It was hands-on, practical, and exactly what Knox felt was necessary for the church. And this is a very influential time within Geneva as well. I mean, Calvin's 1559 institutes are in the final stages of being developed. Knox is there during that time. And Geneva for Knox wasn't just a pit stop. It was where his vision for Scotland began to take root. Every day, preaching to exiles, baptizing his own son at one point, and having conversations with Calvin and others, they sharpened his dream. He pictured a Scotland that was free from the crown's grip, where preachers held influence, not politicians, and where elders governed rather than far-off bishops. Notice his inclination here. I'm not saying he's democratic or that he wants representational government, But he is leaning far more that way than he is towards anything monarchical. And he wants their worship to be simple and plain and real, not drowned out by ceremony. But he also wasn't blind to the fight. Scotland in the 1550s was a mess by John Knox's estimation. Catholicism clung tight, propped up by Mary of Guise and her French muscle, and the Protestants were gaining ground, but they were scattered and hunted and outgunned. So Geneva didn't just inspire Knox, it toughened him up as well. He tasted the Reformed Church in action, and he was ready to bleed for it back home if needs be. So, in other words, Geneva for Knox was both a breather and a battle prep rolled into one. After years of chaos, captivity, flight, relentless preaching, he found a place to plant his feet again, and his exile congregation became a lifeline. But the pull of Scotland never faded, and when he left Geneva in 1559, he wasn't the same man who'd arrived. He now had a vision, honed by Calvin's perfect school, ready to ignite a Reformation that would echo on for centuries. In May 1559, John Knox stepped off a ship in Leith, Scotland, after years of exile, and walked straight into a storm. Protestantism was on the rise, but a Catholic queen regent, Mary of Guise, was clamping down hard, determined to keep Scotland loyal to Rome. Knox, with his fiery preaching and unshakable conviction, was the spark that set the powder keg alight. And to understand why Knox's return was like tossing a match into dry grass, we need to zoom out and take a look at Scotland in the late 1550s. The country was a battlefield of faith and power. On one side stood the Catholic Church, backed by Mary of Guise, the French-born widow of King James V and mother of the absent Queen Mary Stuart, who was off in France. Mary of Guise ruled as regent, and she wasn't shy about using force to keep Scotland Catholic. French troops patrolled the streets, and Catholic clergy held tight to their pulpits and privileges. But beneath the surface, Protestantism was bubbling up, especially in the cities and among the nobility. Reforming ideas such as salvation by faith alone or scripture over tradition were seeping in from England and the continent. And England, by this point, of course, was now thoroughly moving Protestant with the rise of Elizabeth I to the throne. Knox now arrived, having spent years honing his craft in exile, first in England, then in Geneva, and he'd seen what a Reformed church could look like, and he was itching to bring it to his home in Scotland. But of course, Scotland wasn't Geneva, it was a tinderbox. And Knox was the one to blow it all up. He was never one to tiptoe. And so on June 11th, 1559, Knox climbed into the pulpit at St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, and the church was packed. And Knox didn't disappoint. His sermon was a full-throated assault on Catholic idolatry, the worship of saints, relics, and images that to him mocked the true faith. And he called the Mass blasphemous and a twisted version of Christ's sacrifice. The crowd didn't just listen, they acted. As Knox's sermon ended, something snapped. People surged out of the cathedral and into the streets, a mob fueled by years of pent-up frustration. They stormed Catholic churches, toppling altars, smashing statues of saints, and ripping down tapestries. It was a riot, but it was more than that. It was a declaration. The old ways were crumbling, and the people were ready to tear them down with their bare hands. So this wasn't just about theology. For many Scots, the Catholic Church was a symbol of oppression, fat clergy living off tithes while families scraped by. And it was especially seen as a foreign influence coming in from the French. Knox's sermon tapped into that anger, turning religious dissent into a populist uprising. That riot at St. Giles wasn't planned, but it was the shove that pushed Scotland over the edge. And Knox wasn't alone. He had powerful friends, the Lords of the Congregation, as they are called. By the way, that should absolutely become a heavy metal band at some point, the Lords of the Congregation. But it was a coalition of Protestant nobles who had had enough of Mary of Guise' rule, and these weren't starry-eyed idealists. They were hard-nosed politicians and warriors, one including the Queen's half-brother, Lord James Stuart. They saw Protestantism as a way to weaken the regime's grip and curb French influence. And Knox was their megaphone. The alliance wasn't seamless, but Knox was a preacher, not a soldier, and his zeal sometimes grated the nobles' pragmatism. But they needed each other. The lords provided muscle and legitimacy, and Knox brought the fire in the crowds. By late 1559, they'd seized Edinburgh, forcing Maier of Guise to return to Leith. So here Knox is again at the head of another rebellion, and this time they needed firepower. And finally, for once, England stepped in. Queen Elizabeth I, now crowned Protestant Queen of England, saw Scotland as part of the strategic chessboard. A Catholic Scotland allied with France was like being squished between two enemies at once, and she did not like the idea of having Scotland as a dagger in her back, so having a Protestant Scotland could be a nice change. So in early 1560, she sent troops up and ships to back the lords of the congregation, and it paid off. With English cannons pounding Leith, the Protestant forces tightened the noose, and Maier of Guise's position eventually crumbled. She died June 1560, leaving the Catholic cause leaderless. The French, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, sued for peace. And the Treaty of Edinburgh, signed in July, sent the French packing and left Scotland's fate in Protestant hands. And this is a stunning turnaround. In less than a year, Knox and his allies had entirely flipped the script. So now, with the regent gone and the French sidelined, the Protestant lords called a parliament in August of 1560. Big watershed moment here. In a series of swift votes, the assembly banned the Mass, rejected papal authority, and declared Scotland a Protestant nation. But they didn't stop there. They set out to build a new church from the ground up, and they assigned Knox to be the architect. He threw himself into the task, helping draft two foundational documents, the Scots Confession and the Book of Discipline. The Scots Confession was a statement of faith outlining what the new church believed. All the familiar Protestant doctrines are there, and it is unapologetically reformed. The Book of Discipline has had a longer, more interesting shelf life in terms of English history, or English-speaking history, I should say, and is a bit of a how-to manual. It lays out the structure of the new church, no bishops, no fancy titles, just ministers, elders, and deacons. And it tackled things like education, calling for schools in every parish so Scots could read the Bible for themselves. A pretty radical idea, again, when literacy was a luxury. Knox's fingerprints are all over this, and his Geneva exile shines through in every line. But the church that emerges is not just Protestant, it was Presbyterian. A system Knox had admired in Geneva, though it is a little different between Geneva and Scotland. In the case of Scotland, instead of bishops appointed by kings, it was governed by councils of elders or presbyters elected by the people. Again, more than just a theological choice here, it was a power move. It stripped the crown of control over the church, making it hard for future monarchs to meddle. Knox knew Scotland's history. Kings and queens twisted faith and did all kinds of things according to their whims. And he wanted a church that stood apart, and this is how he did it. And this is actually revolutionary. In England, the Reformation kept the church under royal thumb, period, hands down, still to this day, by the way, though not quite as aggressively enacted as maybe it was in Henry VIII's day, but still under royal authority. In Scotland, Knox did otherwise. The Kirk, as it came to be known, was a church of the people, by the people, for the people. And for all of you American history wonks, there is a bit of a story here of Scottish leaders that eventually come to the New World and bring this love for democracy, or at least a representational government, with them. It's all right here with John Knox. But this is a very, very bold experiment in what we would call religious democracy, and Knox is the one doing it. One tragedy faced during this time of success: in December 1560, Knox's wife Marjorie died after a brief illness. Marjorie had been his anchor, steady, devout, fiercely supportive through years of exile and upheaval. They had married in England and weathered the storms of ministry, and they had started a family together. And she left him two sons, Nathaniel and Eleazar. By the end of 1560, Scotland was unrecognizable. The Catholic Church, once untouchable, was in retreat. Monasteries were dissolved and their lands seized by Protestant nobles. Knox, now minister of St. Giles, was the face of the new order, preaching to packed pews and sparring with his critics. But the fight wasn't over. Mary Stuart, the young Catholic queen, would return in 1561, setting up a clash that would define the next decade. For now, though, Knox had a moment to savor his victories. He'd come home to a nation on the edge, and he'd tipped it into the Reformation. In August 1561, the port of Leith buzzed with anticipation as a ship from France delivered Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, back to her homeland. At just 18, she was a Catholic widow. Her husband, King Francis II of France, recently deceased, and she now claimed the Scottish throne by birthright. To many Scots, she was a glorious figure, a symbol of continuity and grace. But to John Knox, the grizzled preacher who had spearheaded Scotland's Protestant Reformation just a year earlier, her arrival was nothing short of a calamity. This young woman, this young Catholic woman, was about to be his nemesis. The Reformation in 1560 had established Protestantism as Scotland's official religion, a triumph Knox had fought for with every fiber of his being. Mary's Catholicism wasn't merely a personal belief, it was a dagger aimed, Knox believed, at the Protestant Kirk, threatening to unravel all he had built. They had their first confrontation in September 1561 within the walls of Holyrood Palace. Mary was very poised and regal, very familiar with the court politics of France, and she summoned Knox to account for his scathing critique of her faith. And he strode in unbowed, his face etched with the scars of a life spent in battle, both physical and spiritual. And without hesitation, he condemned her private mass as an abomination, a whoredom, and a blasphemy that defiled Scotland's newly purified soul. And Mary knew at this point she really had no power to tell him to do otherwise, but he also couldn't make her do otherwise. And she took up the schooling that she'd had in France and the courts there, where she learned to use her charm, hoping to soften the stern old man. She appealed to his loyalty. She smiled. She batted her eyes. She did everything she could to disarm him. But Knox, typical for him, was a rock, unmovable. And he said, quote, "I am in a place where I am demanded of conscience to speak the truth, and therefore I speak the truth. Impugn it whosoever listens." And the air was always full of this tension between the two of them. The young queen clinging to her heritage, facing off against an old man who saw compromise as betrayal. And their clashes do become the stuff of legend. In one memorable exchange, Knox laid out his terms that Mary could be a blessed ruler, that she could be, just like Deborah in the Old Testament, a biblical heroine who supported God's chosen leaders, by which he, of course, meant Protestant ones. Mary was always witty and playful in her responses, sometimes sharp, but Knox was always unshakable. To him, she wasn't just a queen, she was a symbol of Catholic resurgence, a threat to Scotland's spiritual destiny. Yet, we do need to see this more as a bit of the odd couple relationship. It's not as if they're always shouting and screaming in each other's faces. In fact, recent research has pointed out that, at times, Mary and Knox could find common ground, such as when they collaborated to untangle a noble marriage dispute. And there is a bit more of a pragmatism where Knox is willing to work with the queen when he needs to. But such truces was just part of the day-to-day life of politics. Her faith remained to him a poison, and he was vowed to protect Scotland from it. By the late 1560s, the years had taken their toll on John Knox. His body bore the scars of his past, 2 years as a slave in French galleys, decades of preaching and plotting and dodging assassins, and his voice that had used to roar now seemed to fade away. But he refused to break. He always mounted the pulpit again and again to deliver sermons, urging Scotland to cling to the Protestant faith that they had forged. A turning point came finally in 1567 when Mary is forced to abdicate her crown, passing it on to her infant son James VI, who will then go on to become James I of England, uniting Scotland and England under one Protestant country. All during this time, there was still civil war, pitting Mary's loyalists against the Protestant factions. Knox's allies fractured a bit, and Scotland would again descend into chaos. But from his vantage point in Edinburgh, the aging reformer watched as the nation he'd helped shape began initially to tear itself apart. And still he pressed on, and when he died, November 24th, 1572, in his last hours he was surrounded by his loved ones, hoping, though not knowing yet, that Scotland would remain a part of the Protestant world. Eventually, that will come to be by James. He will make sure that both England and Scotland are thoroughly Protestant, each in their own way, and that the Scottish Kirk will be Scotland's future. So Knox's legacy looms large. I often see him as a bit of a Forrest Gump character. He seems to just be everywhere, all these different places in the Reformation. He's in the early Scottish Reformation. He's in the early English Reformation. Then he's in the early worship wars. Then he's in Geneva during the height of Geneva's days. Then he's back in Scotland shaping it. He almost even went to Ireland to be a missionary. So he's just everywhere all at once. But his legacy is very much as the founder of the Presbyterian Church and the system of governance that rippled from there beyond Scotland, influencing all kinds of folks around the world ever since. But he also was big on education, and as I'm going to say in a bit, he was very big on the history of politics and the history of political thinking and of representation in government. But above all, he was a man of zeal. He bore the scars of his torture and his slavery, and above all, he wanted to be a man of the pulpit. He wasn't a man of big books and long words, but he helped set Scotland on a path to a new future. Okay, we're going to go now into the things that Knox is known for, at least in terms of his issues, the things he fought for. These are the things that get brought up ongoing, even to today. Full disclosure, my dissertation was on one of these points. That's why I'm going to nerd out about it. But one of the first ones he is known for is his role in what's called the prayer book controversies in Frankfurt. This is sometimes known as the Troubles in Frankfurt. And what it is, just in a big picture up front, this is the first worship war we have within Protestantism. That is to say, it's the first time we have a group of Protestants that will out loud admit that they are brothers with the opposite side. They are not calling the other side heretical. They are not calling the other side repugnant. They may call names, but that's more just ego. But they're not saying that the other person has left the faith. But they are saying that the way that they worship is a bridge too far for them, and that some of the choices that they make, what we would today call practical ministry, they find to be out of step with Scripture, their reading of Scripture. And again, they haven't elevated the controversy up to the point of denying the faith of the person who disagrees with them, but they're just not going to worship together anymore. Today, we would almost call this the first denominational split. I'm just going to hesitate to do that because it kind of brings a lot of modern baggage with it. But the prayer book controversy is important in the history of English-speaking Christianity. Simply put, we never get away from worship wars. We still have it here with us to this day. But John Knox played a pivotal role in these during the exile in Europe. This episode unfolded against the backdrop of the English Reformation that I was just talking about during Knox's life, when Queen Mary is on the throne in England, enacting the Catholic Restoration. Forced to flee England in 1553, Knox first and foremost lands in the city of Frankfurt. And the controversy there is an inter-Anglican controversy. That's the only way to put it. It's a controversy of those who have left England, and the question now is, how much will they retain what they had done in England back before, or will they carry on and do something new? And that question exposed a deep division amongst Protestant exiles over the nature of Reformed worship. So the Book of Common Prayer had been introduced in 1549 under Edward VI, revised in 1552, and it was a cornerstone of the English Reformation. It is, I'm going to say it boldly and as clearly as I can, it is absolutely Protestant. Up until 1549, 1552, there had not yet been an aggressive Protestant position on the subject of liturgy versus not liturgy. The most that had been expressed was really preferences. Calvin, as I've said, preferred simplistic worship, and that's what he got. He tried to fight with Geneva to have even more done in his early ministry, but he got kicked out for being too much of a hard-nosed person on that question. But liturgy really wasn't the problem. That is, of course, until you start asking people, how far do you need to go to say that you've reformed the liturgy? The prayer book was crafted by Thomas Cranmer, and it sought to standardize the worship. And it did not, despite what everyone says, blend extensive amounts of Catholic practice into Protestant theology. The things that it retained, like kneeling at communion, were actually traditional ancient church practices as well. The problem is that some within the Anglican Church are aware that those in the congregation still retain Catholic sensibilities, so that when they kneel, for example, they're kneeling as they would before the Mass. So you have this question. Do you kneel because it's ancient and good and we should kneel? I mean, Jesus knelt to pray. Or should we take into account the idolatry and the superstition of those kneeling? Same with the sign of the cross, same with vestments, same with all these things. And the Protestant church had always had a very standard position. These things were non-essential. The Bible does not forbid them. The Bible doesn't also demand them. So one's sensibilities or conscience was allowed to make part of the decision. Here, though, what we have is an intensification of the problem, because the prayer book in 1552, the final version, was beloved and used within England, though there were a few that questioned a few of its, what they thought to be compromises. And it had some criticisms. Knox was one of the people who criticized it. He thought it could have gone a little farther. And therefore, when Mary I came to the throne and she reinstated Catholicism, and they're now in exile, Knox was like, well, we don't have to keep doing the prayer book. Knox had been happy to preach within the prayer book's liturgy under Edward VI. Now that he was in Frankfurt in 1554, however, he was skeptical and felt like it was no longer necessary to carry on. Also, he felt like it was a time to keep trying new things, no longer under the watchful eye of the English monarch. They were free to be as biblical as they wanted to be, was Knox's position. However, and I do often raise this point, you could also see the other side's position as well. Laying aside the question of doctrine, like is this appropriate or not in terms of liturgy, you could understand how folks that wanted to maintain the prayer book felt like to criticize it after the exile was a slap in the face. You have to understand, as many as 300 bishops and pastors were being burned alive back in England for their participation in the Protestant Reformation. These exiles carried the prayer book with them, and in a manner of speaking, that prayer book was now soaked in blood. People had paid with their lives for it. So people like Richard Cox, who had been a bishop, he absolutely said, we need to maintain this in exile. This is how we're going to maintain our identity and our focus. People have died for this. Don't just throw it away and call it a bunch of superstitious nonsense. So there's a lot more personal issues involved here, or interpersonal issues, you might say, as well as theological ones. Knox, of course, his objections were always rooted in his commitment to a purer form of worship. His zeal for purity is second to none. And he thought that the prayer book was insufficiently reformed. He didn't think that it was entirely unreformed. He thought it was insufficiently reformed, that it had a few popish practices that contradicted a certain understanding of biblical principles. Again, the issue of kneeling was one of his biggest ones. Others included vestments or using set prayers instead of praying extemporaneously. So Knox's views actually come to a head in the city of Frankfurt. He originally landed and joined a community of English exiles in 1554. The congregation there had been given a task by the city to follow a Protestant form of worship, but it split. One led, like I said, by Richard Cox, who favored the 1552 prayer book, with a few minor changes. The other supported Knox, pushed for more radical liturgy, inspired by Calvin's Geneva. And Knox collaborated with others to draft a revision, stripping away elements of kneeling and other things like vestments that he thought should not have been there in the first place. Long story short, Cox thinks Knox is being flippant, and Knox thinks Cox is being cocky and arrogant and unbiblical. And so this fight, known as the Troubles in Frankfurt, escalated when Knox preached a sermon denouncing the prayer book's shortcomings. And he alienated his friends, and he was accused of stirring division. Tension did, by the way, actually boil over in 1555, and he started a bit of a fist fight in the middle of worship. Eventually, though, Knox won. He had more voices on his side, and Cox did a bit of a end around, and he went to the city magistrates, and he pointed out two things. One, that Knox had a few times said things that seemed to suggest that it was okay to rebel against political rulers. And that Knox, here in the city of Frankfurt, which was a city tied to the Emperor Charles V, that if they were seen as harboring a man of such radical positions, that the city could come under the ire of Charles himself. And the magistrates were actually eager to avoid that type of scrutiny, so they expelled Knox in March of 1555. Basically, Richard Cox just gets John Knox kicked out of the city on a technicality, and therefore Frankfurt continues on with the prayer book. Knox, though, super ticked off by this, as you can imagine, continued to escalate and articulate his views, and in 1556, now back in Geneva, he wrote his book, A Brief Exhortation to England, a treatise that encapsulated his critique of the prayer book and his vision for reform. He called it superstitious, and he urged England to embrace a more thorough reformation now that they were in exile. And this work was not merely polemical. It actually reflects Knox's growing conviction that true worship has to be a complete and full break with any Catholic tradition in the past. So the prayer book controversy, in other words, found no neat resolution in Frankfurt. But for Knox, it concluded with his relocation to Geneva in 1555. There he found a supportive environment to refine his reform views. So his exile experience, in other words, from the conflict in Frankfurt to the clarity of Geneva, solidified forever that Knox was a rejecter of the prayer book, and that he believed that Calvinist principles, as they'll soon to be called, stood opposed to any type of liturgical enshrining of set prayers and kneeling, these types of things. You can see where this is going, hopefully, if you know anything about future English history, where you have the Anglicans versus Presbyterians on liturgy is a hallowed, long-standing fight. Well, this is where it starts. So Knox's fight here over the prayer book highlights the broader tensions within Protestantism between those seeking incremental change and those demanding radical reform. For Knox, the prayer book symbolized compromise, but for Richard Cox and all the Anglicans, it was a document that people paid for with their lives, and they were absolutely going to enshrine it and hallow it for what it was, which is a good and useful Protestant prayer book. Okay, let's talk about Knox and Women. One of the things that people don't like to talk about. We're going to talk about it. Knox's book, The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women, was published in 1558, and it is one of the most infamous works in the Protestant Reformation. The term regiment in the title in this context means rule or government, so Knox was attacking the very concept of female authority in politics. His arguments were a little bit, kind of, based in the Bible, not really, classical philosophy, and things like medieval canon law and contemporary political theory, and they were smashed together in this weird little book that was a response to the historical moment that he lived in, a time when powerful Catholic women ruled much of Europe and were persecuting the Protestant faith. So I want to go into Knox's views and give you a sense of what's going on here. As we've already said, he was a former Catholic, had suffered for the faith, and was now in exile after his time in England. And in the year 1558, which was when the book came out, it was a pivotal year. And these three leaders, these three women, the three M's I sometimes refer to them, Mary I, Mary of Guise, and Catherine de' Medici, were very much Catholic and very much oppressive of Protestant faith. Catherine de' Medici was instrumental in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and the persecution of the Huguenots. Mary of Guise, as we said, is in Scotland, suppressing the Protestant faith there, and Mary I of England is very much forcing Catholicism back onto England. And that's to say nothing of other Catholic countries that were fighting against Protestants physically. You have to understand, into the 1550s, around about this time, 1558, there was a real chance that the Protestant Reformation was going to be completely wiped out politically, simply oppressed and burned out. So these rulers are not just women, they're Catholics. And it's a double issue for Knox, who saw Protestantism, of course, as the true faith. Their reigns coincided with this broader struggle, in other words, between Protestants and Catholics. Now, he wrote The First Blast in Geneva. He claimed at the time that he'd had a conversation with John Calvin about it and that he'd gotten some verbal approval from Calvin on this subject. More on that in a second. He probably didn't get much approval after all, but anyway. But for Knox, what he sees is these three monarchs, frankly, destroying the Reformed faith left, right, and center. And he sits down and he comes up with this argument and he writes it down and he frames it as if female rule itself is monstrous. Having a political ruler who is female is against nature. Monstrous here just means anti-nature, against the way things ought to be. It's an aberration. And as you can imagine, this book has gone down as one of the most widely read books in the history of misogyny. But the book itself, if you read it, is not exactly a tour de force. He argues that women in power is contrary to nature and reason, and then he tries to make it against Scripture as well. And as we'll see in a minute, he doesn't do it. And then he just carries on from there. So he construes his case using the three sources. From the Bible, he goes to Genesis 3:16. He says that after Adam's disobedience, God decrees, your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Knox takes this out of the relationship between men and women in general and takes it into the realm of politics, that women's subordination is a divine mandate in politics itself. And by the way, again, we're only talking about politics here. We're talking about rulers of kingdoms. He also cites 1 Timothy 2, the thing about let women be silent, referring to church service has nothing to do with politics, and he refers to 1 Corinthians 11:3, that the man is the head of the woman in the home. Again, has nothing to do with politics. Knox asserts that therefore, because of these three verses, God has asserted a natural order that men must lead and women follow, and that by deductive logic, female rulers defy this order and are therefore monstrous, living against Scripture itself. Now, everyone, of course, is saying, what about Deborah? What about Deborah? Well, he didn't really care about Deborah. His argument was that Deborah was just a punishment for sin, and that he therefore says it is not a divine biblical text that shows women in political authority. The vast majority of the book, though, he relies on Aristotle and medieval thought. And that's a clue right there. Again, I'll explain what this book is in a second, but I'm setting up the situation here. So he appeals to Aristotle's politics, and he argues that men are naturally superior in reason and authority just by the accidents of nature. Knox therefore embraced this and argued that women lack the capacity for governance in and of itself. And he cherry picks historicals in like Roman antiquity that was famous for female leadership leading to a crisis. He then very quickly starts talking about political theory itself, not very well, talking about the idea of the metaphor of the body politic in which the ruler is the head of the people. And he says that only men can serve as the head, even though that seems to be referring to marriage. He says that that now refers to politics as well. He says that a woman should be seen as frail and unstable, and that disqualifies them for political office. This is more like the divine rights of kings, that men are to rule because of the authority placed on the office. Okay, what in the world is Knox doing here? Well, the simple answer is that what Knox is doing is he's trying to go through a window because a door is closed. This book, as I'll say in a minute, was not well respected in its day, and no one cited it or liked it, and people actually did not like it one bit. But what's happened here is that for the very first generation of the Reformation, all of the reformers, every single one of them right out of the gate, argued that the Protestant faith is not politically rebellious. All of them. Luther, Zwingli, Calvin does this, Bullinger does this, Cranmer especially does this. Tyndale's first theological treatise is on the obedience of the Christian man. He's talking about political obedience to Henry. This is the entire perspective for early Protestants, is we will not rebel, we will censure, we will speak up, we will say things if we feel that something is wrong, but if the king were to come and tell us that our lives are in jeopardy for standing up for the faith, we're not going to take up sword and arms to defend ourselves. It's a pacifist position. The only person who changes this position, by the way, is Martin Luther in 1531. He had spent all of his early career being like, we will not defend ourselves, we will not even arm ourselves. And then finally, 1531, the political rulers in Germany are like, hey, we're going to get killed if we don't arm ourselves and defend ourselves. And Luther's like, okay, maybe a little defense. A little self-defense is fine. And then a couple of years after that, he's like, actually, just go to war. It's fine. You can defend the faith. The Reform side, though, and obviously the Anabaptist side, anyone not Lutheran, basically, still stays with the political obedience perspective. Again, Tyndale's first topic of choice in theology is on obedience. So what's happening here is, in 1558, John Knox, suffering his second exile for the faith, watching these three Catholic queens come in to persecute and destroy the faith, wants, and you can feel it if you read the book, you can just tell he wants so bad to just simply say, let's take up arms and rebel and overthrow these queens and their reign of blood, and let's institute for the first time in some cases, the Protestant faith. But he can't say that because the Protestant message from the Reformed faith for an entire generation has been to rebel against the political authorities is to rebel against God's own order. Therefore, to fight against it puts you at odds with God himself. So Knox has no capacity in Protestant theology behind him to cite to say we should be at war with these Catholic queens. So what is the next best thing? Delegitimizing. That's all he's doing. And he doesn't do it well. His whole argument is basically, okay, I know we're not supposed to rebel against monarchs and that puts us against God and that we jeopardize our souls if we go against the king and rebel and start a civil war. But hear me out. What if they weren't legitimate rulers to begin with? Yeah, that's all he's saying is, I want to have a rebellion. I can't find one, so I'm going to throw everything in the kitchen sink into this book to try to argue for the delegitimizing of female authority. Now, almost immediately, no one wants anything to do with this book. The first blast landed a bit like a bombshell, and unfortunately it was published in Geneva just a matter of months before Mary I died and Elizabeth I came to the throne. Write that down as probably the worst timing in Reformation history, because now Elizabeth, the Protestant queen, is livid that John Knox has published this book, and he's published it in Geneva. And John Knox actually gets Calvin into trouble. Very few people talk about this, but when Elizabeth came to the throne, Calvin sent one of his commentaries up to Elizabeth trying to thank her and, sent a nice letter with the book. And he said, basically, welcome to the throne. Let me know if you need anything kind of energy. The book got sent back, and it was very specifically said, we don't want anything to do with Geneva right now. Elizabeth was absolutely tired of Calvin by that point. And Calvin's is kind of like, what did I do? Because he didn't do anything. Because what he now found out is that Knox had used his name and the name of Geneva to bolster this book. He had argued that he had run these ideas by Calvin, and that Calvin had given verbal approval to these arguments about the authority of women. Calvin was like, no, I didn't. Not like that. Calvin, though, is now shocked because he's being included with these radical ideas about women, which he had himself never written. And no, Calvin didn't read this book. The book was written in English. Calvin can't speak English. So the most that happened was John Knox went and said, hey, I have some ideas about, women in authority. What do you think? And Calvin just said, yeah, that sounds fine, I guess. This kind of in passing. And Knox goes and writes a full angry book, publishes it in Geneva. And from then on, Elizabeth has very little or nothing to do with Geneva as a result. If you're wondering where some of the English-speaking anti-Calvinism comes from, this is one of those moments. Calvin gets lumped in as one of the uprisers, the rabble-rousers that tries to critique and destroy Elizabeth's throne. Calvin had nothing to do with it. Knox did. But the book, in other words, falls like a lead balloon. Almost no one quotes this thing in the Protestant Reformation. And in fact, just to prove the point even further, Knox himself will never make these same arguments again. Almost immediately, he goes from, well, maybe we can just delegitimize the authority of these queens and then we can rebel. The very next thing he says in one of his next books on rebellion, and as I'll say in a minute, is, let's just forget all the previous stuff and let's actually talk about rebellion. So he tries to go into the window, no one's buying it, and so he just starts kicking down the door and saying maybe obedience in all cases is not the best idea. Now, this text on the monstrous regiment of women, yeah, it gets trotted out every now and again by weirdos, but it really has no lasting major impact in terms of no, Scotland is forever misogynistic, or Knox himself forever treated women with deep disdain and disrespect. As I already pointed out, much later, when Mary, Queen of Scots, is sitting in front of him, he's actually going to encourage her to be a Deborah. He doesn't ever sit there and tell her that she has no right to the throne. He never brings this argument up again. His ideas do shape ideas on gender and power. And if you wanted to look at it as a sad story in the history of misogyny, it kind of does fit that category. Because the fact that a book like this could be written in the first place is enough, even if it didn't have much of a long shelf life. It did serve a point, which is that it bolstered and it galvanized a lot of Protestants to rise up against Mary of Guise. and they contributed to her downfall in the triumph of the Reformation in Scotland. The Presbyterian Church, in many ways, wouldn't have gotten the gumption to even attack or defend itself against Mary of Guise if Knox hadn't at least cracked the door open to the thought of even challenging politics from the vantage of the church. The first blast does get cited from time to time whenever there is a queen on the throne, whether it's Elizabeth I or Mary II. And those who were resisting women's political participation in the 19th century love this book. They brought it up all the time. So it's a lasting stain on Knox's legacy, this idea of political repression of women. And it's something that people need to know about. Okay, having talked about Knox and his monstrous regiment of women, it does raise the question, though, of resistance theory. Full disclosure, this is my dissertation, my PhD dissertation. I know you don't care. But this is where I spent a lot of time. Because, as I just said, for the entire first generation of the Reformation, no one believed in political disobedience. That doesn't mean that none of them ever engaged in political disobedience. What I'm saying is that what they kept saying repeatedly is, we will not rebel, we will not rebel. There will be no protesting, marching, screaming in the streets, calling for the overturning of political rulers. Knox finds himself in the second generation of the Reformation uncomfortable with that choice as he's seeing the political Catholic rulers continue to suppress and oppress the Protestant faith. And this is an important issue because, frankly speaking, this is the only doctrine that the Protestant church, the mainline Protestant church, almost entirely changes its position on from one generation to the next. On all issues like Scripture, salvation by faith, sacraments, Trinity, by and large, they shake out their views on those things and they write them down pretty quick. And there's not a major tone shift or theology shift on big doctrines for Protestants. This one there is, on the issue of politics. It is scarcely, almost impossible today to find someone that teaches and preaches the amount of obedience that William Tyndale does in the beginning of his ministry, in his obedience to the Christian man. He's basically saying, slaughter us, and we will not rebel. And he's citing Psalm 82, one of the more obscure psalms. And he says that because of Psalm 82, William Tyndale argues, God has placed political rulers as gods on earth, the divine right king idea, and that therefore to fight against a political ruler is to fight against God himself. He says this explicitly. Try as hard as you might, you're not going to find modern Christians that teach that almost anywhere. Nobody thinks this way, but they did in the first part of the Reformation. So what Knox is actually doing, as messily as he might be doing it as he attacks women in themselves, what he's doing is trying to find a way of saying the voice of the people matters, and if there is a bloody oppressor of the voice of the people, then they need to be replaced as well. So resistance theory is what we're talking about. And resistance theory is the idea that the subjects, the people, have the right and sometimes the duty to resist or overthrow rulers who act unjustly or against God's will. Knox's articulation of this theory, by the way, is groundbreaking, as it directly challenges the dominant doctrine of the divine right of kings. It also emerges as this new Calvinist theology. By the way, as I said, this is not a Calvinist position until Knox. It later becomes one. Calvinists are very, very well known for rebellion. But it takes Knox to get that ball rolling. It's not Calvin. If all you have is Calvin, you will not end up with resistance theory. He has a little bit of a wink-wink for the Spartan ephors, but he doesn't really allow for rebellion at all. He's too conservative. Knox, though, he'll raise a fist, and he'll stand in front of the Queen and say, you need to go if you're going to embrace the Catholic faith. So Knox's arguments for resistance start to show up, as I said, in the 1550s. The three works that stand out, as I said, are the first blast against the monstrous regiment of women, 1558, where, as I said before, he goes through the window trying to delegitimize the authority of the queens in general. And then there's the appellation of John Knox, also 1558, and then a letter to the commonalty of Scotland, also in 1558. Notice that he seems to be pushing on this idea all at once in 1 year. We've already covered the first blast. I won't cover that again. Let's look at the appellation. In this address, he actually is appealing to the Scottish nobility, urging them to overthrow Mary of Guise directly. Knox labels her a tyrant for her Catholic policies and persecution of Protestants, and therefore he said that her choices have violated God's will. And he writes, quote, "It is not only lawful to punish to the death such as those that have committed capital crimes, but also it is the duty of every man according to his power to withstand tyrants and to remove their tyranny," end quote. He's saying this in 1558, and again, a lot of respect ought to be said here. This looks like it's something written in 1758, and for him to be saying it in 1558 is quite telling. But this passage does encapsulate Knox's view that resistance was both a right and an obligation. This is followed up by his letter to the commonalty, which was, as you might imagine, written to the everyday people, to the common people, to support the Protestant cause that they must resist Catholic authorities. There he tells all Christians that it is their shared duty to advance God's kingdom, though he did stop short of calling for a popular revolt. Instead, he argued that they should support the noble efforts for rebellion. So his arguments are not only abstract, they're having legs. He's saying, go do this. They translate into action. Is it any wonder that by 1559, 1560, he is the one preaching, and all the people that are listening to him are running out and burning churches and altars and tearing down statues? And so on this issue, on the issue of resistance, John Knox absolutely is known as a forerunner of everything we consider to be modern politics. Fourth and lastly, I want to discuss John Knox's History of the Reformation in Scotland, also written in the late 1550s, published posthumously in 1587. It is one of the most significant works documenting the Scottish Reformation. You can still find editions of this online if you go look for it. It is Knox writing down his story as a first-hand participant and as an advocacy for Protestantism. He creates a narrative that is equal parts historical chronicle, a little bit theological manifesto, and really just a personal memoir, if you want to put it that way. It spans the early stirrings of the Reformation in 1520s, and all the way down to the Reformed Kirk in 1560. And it's very vivid, very dramatic. It's actually not a bad read. And it's written and it's sort of organized into 5 books. The first book covers the early Reformation up to George Wishart. Book 2 focuses on Knox entering the Reformation and then all the way up to the murder of Cardinal Beaton. Book 3 looks at all the political and military struggles up to 1558. Book 4 looks at the culmination of the Protestant uprising and the establishment of the Reformed Kirk. And then finally, Book 5 gives a lot of high detail about Knox and his confrontations with Mary, Queen of Scots, though that section was unfinished when he died. It's an important book, worth looking at, and it is by far his most influential text, describing Scotland and its future. Okay, that's John Knox. That's all I got.